Okay, this board is coming back the board just returned from closed session where we met with Dr. Beckler for the purpose of superintendent's annual evaluation and no action was taken. I will call for roll call. Mr. Bell, are you present? Mr.
Present.
Bell?
Present.
Thank you. Cece?
Here.
Dr. Philly?
Here.
Mrs. Koo?
Here.
And Reina Diaz here. I will call this meeting to order at 6:41. And I would like to ask Mr. Bowler, if you can please lead us in the flag salute.
I am happy to do that. If everyone would please stand. Put your right hand over your heart and repeat. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
of the United States
and
of America
and to the republic
and to the
Republic
for which it
Republic.
stands,
for which it stands,
one nation under God,
for which it stands,
one nation under God,
indivisible,
with liberty and justice for all.
for all.
Thank you, Mr. Bowler. We will have a minute of reflections. Thank you. Please be seated. Okay. I need a motion to adopt the agenda.
So move.
Moved by Mr. Bell, second.
Second.
Second by Dr. Finlay. Any discussion? I will call for vote. Mr. Bell,
Yes.
Mrs. Carroll,
Yes.
Dr. Finlay,
Yes.
Mrs. Koo,
Yes.
and Reina Diaz, yes. This is item A, is when we received requests to address the board, but no request was received. So we will move to item number 9, presentation of findings from EUSD budget review. Dr. Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President, members of the board and community. Tonight, we are pleased to have join us representatives from School Services of California, and more specifically, we will have Brianna Garcia as well as Matt Phillips, who will be here to present to the board a report of findings regarding the Duarte Unified School District budget. As the board will recall, as early as late 2019, and then moving into early 2020, prior to the pandemic, we were having a conversation as a school district about doing some comprehensive reviews of programs and services, one being our overall budget, and then the other being our special education program. And we'll be presenting both of those this evening, the findings. We're going to start first with the budget review. And I would ask the members of the board to allow our team from School Services of California to present comprehensively the entire report and scribe any and all questions and inquiries that you would have. We'll take all questions at the end, and then staff will also be engaged in that conversation and Q&A at the end of the presentation. And so with that, Madam President, with your permission, I would like to introduce Brianna and Matt from School Services of California. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Amerson. Good evening, Madam President Diaz, members of the board, and members of the community. Looks like I am up first here on the agenda, so I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with the budget review. If you bear with me here, I'm going to share my screen so that we can all look at the same thing. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. I'm gonna cheat a little bit and not be in presentation mode. My screens do funky things when I go into presentation mode, so I'm just going to leave it right here. Appreciate the invitation on behalf of Brianna, who is going to be speaking to the special education report. We are honored to join you. Thank you for your trust in School Services. And I'll go ahead and kick it off here with the budget review. As Dr. Emerson mentioned, the district reached out for an independent and objective analysis over the Duarte Unified School District's budget, the finances, and we're going to talk a little bit about what a budget is. One of the benefits that I have at School Services is being able to work with school districts across the state of California. And when we undertake something of this scope, of this nature, like a budget review, I have the advantage because in California, every school district, and there's about 1,000 school districts, is required to use the same format, which the standardized account code structure. There's also certain assumptions that I would expect to see when I take a look at a budget. So whether you're down in Southern California in Duarte, or up here in Sacramento, or way up in Northern California in Del Norte County, you're going to see a lot of the same things and have a lot of the same expectations. So in looking at Duarte's budget, took a look at some of the major assumptions. And as we'll talk about with any budget, the best budgets are the ones that have well-documented assumptions. We have to go into any budget knowing that the budget is going to change over time, certainly as the assumptions change. And the conversation always has to be around what were the assumptions that were used to develop the budget at the time, not necessarily what was the end result of those assumptions. So in looking at some of the assumptions, again, just kind of a high-level summary, and then I'll get into some of the details. Took a look at the district's enrollment and average daily attendance, as that contributes to the local control funding formula. Took a look at some of the other one-time funding or the revenue streams of the district, and then switched gears and took a look at some of the expenditure categories. I break those down into two buckets, personnel-related costs and non-personnel-related costs. And then I also took a look at the district's ending reserves, or the fund balances. And I will foreshadow the fund balance area is the part that grabbed my attention the most. And I'll speak to that as I get there in the presentation. Taking a look at not only the current budget, and I was looking at the first interim, which I'll explain where that is in the process in a couple of slides. I did go back a couple of years to really develop some expectations based on trend analyses. So looked at the 18-19 and 19-20 close, in addition to the budget for 2021, as well as the two out years at the time. Also took a look at some historical information related to salaries, enrollment, and ADA, and so forth. There was a part two of the budget analysis, which took a look at some comparative data, comparing Duarte to some similarly sized unified school districts in the near geographic region. I will unveil a little bit later on in the presentation which districts those were and how we came up with the criteria to determine those districts. And looking at the comparative data, we took a look at not only how those districts spend their resources or how they prioritize their resources, is a term you might hear as a board member, but also took a look at some statewide certified data that was available for teacher salaries or certificated non-management employees. Unfortunately, there's not a similar pool of information available for administrators and classified non-management, but nonetheless, that is the information that we have in front of us today. So where are we in our current budget cycle? And I think about our budget cycle right now being the 2021 school year or the 2021 fiscal year. We follow this little red arrow around and we've almost completed the clock, right? So 12 o'clock would be the start of the new fiscal year, July 1, 2021. The board, I noticed, has its agenda up. Just a few days from now, you're going to be having a public hearing for your 21-22 adopted budget, and then you'll be adopting that budget later on this month. We are at the tail end of the 2021 fiscal year, where at this point in June, we have 11 months in the rearview mirror. The period that I took a look at in working with the district actually goes back to December. So taking a look at the first interim. It was a timing thing at that point when the district did reach out. First interim was the most recently available. But what I do think it does is it really highlights the notion that when you think about a budget, we want to think about the assumptions that were used at the time, knowing that the assumptions were going to change, or they will change. And I would say that 2021 is as good of example as we can find with assumptions changing, with how quickly the tides of California's economy are going in and going out. So what is a budget? I'm going to mention this at the beginning here, and I'm going to reinforce it at the end of the budget presentation. That a budget is a projection based on assumptions that are anchored in current conditions. And to me, that's a really powerful statement. I spend a lot of time working with school districts in negotiations, and many times I hear, how a budget might be used as a hindsight 2020 document, and that is not the intent of a budget. A budget is an accumulation of current assumptions. It's a big math problem. You add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and the result of all of those different equations comes up with the current budget. So I want to have a conversation around what were the assumptions that were used at the time that first interim was brought before the board and was ultimately approved by the board. So at the time, I apologize for the small numbers here. This is as big as I can make it and still fit it within the parameters of the slide, something I'll have to look into. But at the time that first interim was adopted, this is the first interim multi-year projection for the general fund. So if you went back to your information that was provided to you as a board member in your board member packet, look at that, there's some technology. I'll zoom in a little bit because I see people moving in closer to the screen. At the time that the board approved its first interim, there's two rows that I always look at when I look at a multi-year projection. I have the good fortune of participating with CSBA in its new board members induction and its Masters in Governance training. And we spend a lot of time talking about multi-year projections and what are the really important lines to look at. For me, the most important line is always going to be this yellow line right here, which is what is the change in our reserves in any given year? All right. And specifically, what is the change in the unrestricted reserves in any given year? So when we looked at the first interim and it was developed at the time, the district was projecting that for 2021, it was going to have a small surplus in its unrestricted funds, meaning that it was going to receive more revenue than it was going to spend in that given year of unrestricted resources. And that's a good place to be. We certainly don't want to be in the position where we are storing a lot of money because we want to spend today's dollars on today's kids. What was alarming for me when I looked at the first interim projection is when you get out in the 21-22 year and the 22-23 year, that even though the district was showing that it did have a surplus, meaning that revenues were greater than expenses, that surplus was a direct result of significant reductions that were going to need to be made in both the 21-22 and 22-23 year. Now, at the time that the first interim was put together, again, this is back in December of 2020, there was a lot of unknowns on the horizon with respect to the financial status of the state of California, certainly with respect to education funding in the state of California. And I would say that the silver lining of this presentation is things have gotten better from the state's perspective and what the state is going to be providing to schools in the 21-22 year and beyond. So you'll likely see the benefits of that when the team presents the estimated actuals and adopted budget for 21-22. But again, the conversation around budgets always has to be what were the assumptions at the time that the budget was built. All right, let me zoom back out here so I can get my whole slide on the screen. Perfect. So, excuse me. I think it's important that when we talk about budgets, I spend a lot of time focused on the unrestricted side of the general fund because that is our lifeblood. That's where the majority of our revenues come in, where the board has discretion over how to use those funds. When we look at the unrestricted resources available to Duarte, funds that come in through the local control funding formula accounts for about 95% of the district's resources. Okay, very, very significant. And the reason why it's important that we talk about the LCFF and the related assumptions is because those assumptions really drive what we're going to be able to do or not do going forward. And when I talk about those assumptions, I'm really speaking to what are the number of students that we expect to be enrolled in Duarte? How often are they going to be showing up, which is the average daily attendance? And then what is the additional funding that the state is going to provide towards the local control funding formula? Okay, and so those three accumulation of assumptions are really what is driving the LCFF revenues for the district. Now, Duarte was not alone in this standpoint, but in the 2021 year, the district experienced a pretty significant decline in the number of students that were enrolled in the district. It looks like about 3% for you guys. I will share with you that at the statewide level, the state has about 6 million students, had just over 6 million students going into the 2021 year. The state expects to lose about 20 to 30,000 students on the natural each and every year. And in the 2021 year, the state lost 160,000 students as a direct result of the pandemic. So The loss that you are seeing here locally in Duarte, you are not alone in experiencing that loss. It is a widespread thing here in the state of California with the number of students that fell off of the public school ranks. Well, why is that important? Because each student that we lose or each student that we have in the district generates about $10,500 in revenue for the district. So as we decline in the number of students, we are losing resources that are available to us because we are funded on those students. So again, at the time that first interim was developed back in December, the state was projecting no increase in school funding for the foreseeable future, not only for the 2021 year, but into 21-22 and 22-23. They expressed that through a 0% COLA. Good news, the state has since done a 180, and they're currently projecting a COLA for the 21-22 year. So that is good news. We celebrate that. But again, at the time the first interim was developed, there was no COLA on the horizon, and not a single district in the state of California was projecting that a COLA was coming because it was still relatively dire straits. One item that did jump out at me when looking at the district's assumptions for the number of students is the enrollment. So in 2021, the district was down to just under 3,300 students. The assumptions at the time were projecting an increase in the number of students in 21-22 and 22-23. We certainly hope that is the case, that the students do come back, that they return in full beginning in the 21-22 year. But when we think about assumptions, there's always risks associated with assumptions. And the more aggressive we are with expecting or budgeting that the students are going to return, if the students don't return, well, then we have a gap to fill, because again, each student is worth about $10,500 to the district. So that'll be one of the assumptions that I caution the board and staff to continue to watch very closely. And I know under Dr. Emerson's watch, this is something that is looked at on the daily and will continue to be looked at on the daily because it is so critical to the funding for school districts. Now, some good news is the state of California recognizing that there was a significant exodus of students from the public school system in 2021, provided what we call at school services a hold harmless, meaning that districts across the state of California are not penalized for the loss of students in both the 2021 and the 21-22 years. So we essentially have a one-year reprieve here, where in the 21-22 year, let's assume we stay flat in the number of students. We are not penalized. We're not going to lose the $10,500 per student. That's the good news. The bad news is that in the 22-23 year, if the students don't come back, that's when we're going to see that hit. And we're going to see that decrease in the funding that we receive from the state of California as a result of the lost students. So we've got a year to get all those students back, to show them how great Duarte is. Hopefully the students do come back on the natural in 21-22. One of the areas that districts across the state are constantly trying to manage are contributions to other programs. Okay, and again, I kicked this off by talking about the focus on the unrestricted side of the budget. Well, the reason we talk about contributions is because contributions, the reason we call it a contribution is because it's a contribution of our unrestricted resources to programs that are either not fully funded or required to set dollars aside by the state of California. Okay, and the two largest programs in Duarte, as they are in just about every district in the state of California, are the special education program and the routine restricted maintenance program. My colleague Brianna is going to talk about the special education program in her presentation, so I'm not going to steal her thunder right now. I'll let her unveil some of that information through her presentation. But the routine restricted maintenance, the dollar figure you see from 1920 to 2021 actually decreased a little bit, the support that program needs. That's a direct result of the fact that the contribution to routine restricted is just a calculation. It's 3% of total general fund expenditures. So as we spend less in the general fund, we're required to set aside less for routine restricted maintenance. So switching gears, so that was kind of the top half, the revenue side of the unrestricted general fund. Switching gears over to salaries and benefits, or the personnel costs. Most districts in the state of California spend anywhere from 85 to 90% of their resources on people. We're in the people business. We can't do what we do without people, specifically educating children. Duarte is no different. from that standpoint. In the 1920 and in the 2021 first interim, the district projected to spend 86% of its resources on people, which is salaries and benefits. That includes all the people. So all of our teachers, all of our bus drivers, custodians, administrators, everything in the aggregate. Also includes any payments to retirement systems, and payments for health and welfare benefits on behalf of employees. So the fact that the district continues to spend 86% of its resources is not surprising. What I will point out is that the total dollar figure decreased from 1920 to 2021, primarily because the district is using some of its restricted resources to pay for some of these personnel costs. They're using some of those one-time dollars received for COVID relief to help offset some of the costs. But again, overall, district is maintaining its effort on people at 86%. Okay, same concept for the non-people side or the non-personnel side, materials, services, and capital outlay. This includes everything from instructional materials to utilities to keep the lights on, to fuel for the buses. The board will note that there is a decrease in projected expenses from 1920 to 2021. Some of that is a direct result because schools have been closed for the 2021 year. They were closed for most of the school year. So some of those day-to-day things such as utilities, well, if there's nobody in the classroom, we don't need to keep the light on. Another area where savings is happening across the state is not only on utilities, but even a little bit on vacancy savings, specifically with paraprofessionals and substitute costs. Very difficult to replenish or rehire folks for less than a full-time position during the pandemic. So there'll likely be some savings there when the books do close in 2021. And I'm sure Jim will speak to that in his presentation. All right, so let's talk about reserves. Reserves are what is left over. So for us, lay folks, this is our savings account. Okay, it's our checking account if we don't have a savings account. It's one-time dollars that once they're gone, they're gone. Here in the state of California, the state does require a district the size of Duarte to maintain a minimum of a 3% reserve, which is 3% of its total general fund expenditures. Okay, that is the floor. The state does not set a ceiling, but it certainly sets a minimum. In the 1920 year, looking at statewide certified data, when you take the aggregate of all unified school districts in the state of California, the average reserve at the end of the 1920 year was 18.8%. Okay, so that's about 6 times what the state required minimum is. And so what that tells me is the state required minimum is just that. It's a minimum. It's not intended to be sufficient. But for the state, it's the flag that says if a district falls beneath that, that's kind of a danger Will Robinson, right? We need to come in and have an intervention. There's also a national association, the Government Finance Officers Association, which recommends a 17% reserve, which is effectively 2 months of expenses. When I look at the reserves for Duarte, and we spend a lot of time talking about budget and assumptions, so I want to make this point very clear. When you go back to the previous 2 closed years, okay, so the books have been closed, there's no more assumptions, there's no more projections, this is actual numbers. In the 1819 and 1920 school years, at the end of the year, the district was right at that 3% minimum. Okay, and when you think about that relative to what you see at the average unified school district of 18%, that's a pretty significant delta. It's a very, very low number, and for me, it raises the flag up the flagpole as it has for you and your team as well. And I know it's certainly something that you're paying attention to. Reserves are really important. We only have to go back a few months when we go back to May of 2020 and June of 2020, when the governor was projecting a 10% reduction to school funding year over year. Okay, if that had come to fruition, we might be having a different conversation right now where the reserves wouldn't be at 3%, they'd be less than that. Fortunately, the governor and the legislature did not implement any cuts to education in 2021. So we're kind of treading water right now, at least as a first interim. Potentially that reserve percentage will come up when the books do close. As I mentioned before, there's probably going to be some cost savings as a result of school closures, but we know those are things that we're going to have to make up, certainly with learning loss mitigation in the 21-22 year. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about reserves when we talk about the comparative data later on. But I did think it was important, especially because of where we are right now in the fiscal calendar, to talk about what was not in first interim. This has been as an eventful of the 6 months as I've ever experienced in school finance with the changes that have occurred. We just saw when the governor released his January budget proposal and then May revise, the largest year-over-year growth in school funding that we've ever experienced under Proposition 98. Okay, so a lot of changes have been happening over the last 6 months. Included in some of those changes, the governor and legislature passed Assembly Bill 86 back in, I think it was late February or early March of 2021, which authorized $6.6 billion to go to schools to address learning loss mitigation and get kiddos back in school. Specific to Duarte, the in-person instruction grant, the district was eligible to receive up to $1.11 million had the district reopened by April 1st. There's also a tranche of funding for the expanded learning that was part of AB 86, $2.46 million to really mitigate learning loss for students via either robust summer school programs, extended instructional year, high dose tutoring, is a term that the governor has coined. There's also going to be some additional federal stimulus dollars that will come in on the restricted side of the budget that, again, are intended to respond to the pandemic to mitigate learning loss. We call them ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, and that is in the neighborhood of about $9.5 million for the district that's going to be coming in that you've already been awarded. You just haven't received the funds yet. All of these dollars are one-time in nature. So certainly when the district is looking at its current financial position, it's going to feel like, hey, let's pop some champagne bottles. Don't do that with these dollars. These are one-time dollars. Once they're gone, they're gone. We can certainly leverage them to help with our current reserve situation. But certainly within a couple of years when these dollars are exhausted, we want to end up in a better place than we are right now. So based on the assumptions that were used at first interim, and again, a lot has changed, but at that time, based on what we knew right then, there was nothing that jumped off the page where through our statewide lens and looking at many budgets statewide, that jumped off the page as a kind of a whoa, right? Where did that come from? Certainly I poked and prodded and asked Jim and team a lot of questions about the assumptions that were used. But again, nothing significantly deviated from what I would see or expect to see on a statewide basis. But again, two items of concern in looking at the district's current financial situation and its budget going forward is the low reserves and then also those projections used for declining enrollment. Again, hopefully those kiddos come back when school starts up again in the 21-22 school year. So that's the budget side. So I'm going to set that to the side, and then I'm going to transition to the comparative analysis that was done as part of the report as well. When we think about comparing ourselves to other districts, we want to be very intentional about who we choose to compare ourselves against. And so I put some districts out there for the district to use. Certainly the district had its own list of districts. But where the dust settled is we wanted to compare ourselves against other similarly sized unified school districts with similar demographics in a geographic radius around us. Okay, the reason, I'm going to give you a couple reasons here. The reason that we choose districts around us is because those are the districts that we're competing for talent, okay, for employees. Okay, so thinking about how we prioritize our resources is important. Thinking about what we can pay and compensate employees is important. The reason for the limitation for unified school districts, because in the state of California, you have three types of districts. Unified school districts, which is the whole continuum K-12. You have high school districts, which is just going to be the secondary grades. And then elementary school districts, which is just the primary grades. The reason for choosing only unified districts is we really wanted an apples and apples comparison. We serve the K-12 continuum. We want to compare ourselves against other districts that serve the K-12 continuum as well. There's also a funding consideration. High school districts receive considerably more funding, all things being equal, than unified school districts. Elementary school districts receive more than unified school districts, but not quite as much as high school districts. And so we wanted to try and level out the funding playing field as well as we talk about resources that are available to us for expenditure. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a lay of the land, this data here, the financial data that we're going to talk about, unfortunately at the time, the state had only certified through 1819. So when we look at this notion of a student population, through 1819, the district absolutely had a stable student population. And then in 1920 and 2021, dropped about 250 students over those 2 years. So certainly something worth considering when we look at the demographics. All right, looking at resources available to the district. Many folks in the public don't fully grasp or understand how districts are funded, and that's totally understandable because it's very complicated. But suffice to say that not all districts are created equal. So even within our list here, similarly sized unified school districts with relatively similar student demographics, there's a pretty significant funding disparity in the amount of funding per student. So we see ourselves there ranked 8th on the list. We receive less than the average unified district across the state of California in LCFF dollars per student, certainly well behind Bassett and Carpinteria in Banning. These are all state-funded districts. There's a whole nother set of the 1,000 school districts, which we call community-funded districts, that receive well north of $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 per student. So in the grand scheme, we're not a poorly funded district, but we're certainly not a highly funded district with respect to funding that we receive from the state. Why is that important? Well, that's important when we think about how much can we allocate for certain priorities. Recognizing that we're not a highly funded school district in the state of California, we're never going to have the highest paid employees or the smallest class sizes, right? The best working conditions. We can't be a leader in all three of those simply by virtue of the fact that we're not a highly funded district from the state of California. So as a board, as we think about, well, how do we then document our priorities, okay, and measure our priorities, recognizing that we're never going to be able to spend the most, right? Spend the most per student. What we can do is we can look at how we allocate our resources as a percent of dollars received. Okay, that kind of levels out the playing field a little bit. So this first table here, I'm going to go through a series of tables. This first table is certificated non-management. So this is going to be all of our teaching positions that are not administrators. The district does spend a higher percentage of its resources on teachers than what you see in this comparative group. Okay, 35.18%. And this is just salary. This is not benefits, STIRS, or health and welfare. This is just salary. Okay. You could also look on the right-hand side, and I know I just spoke about we can't measure it on a dollar basis, but the $4,900 per student on teachers does rank commensurately with the percentage as well, 6th on the list. Okay, when we transition, we look at administrators. Again, the district, when we think about priorities, the district is a little bit higher than the comparative group average on administrator salaries. And then when we transition to the third set of data points here, looking at classified non-management salaries. So this is any employee in the district that's either not an administrator or is not in a position that requires a teaching credential. Custodians, bus drivers, clerical, maintenance workers, okay? Classified non-management. Again, when we think about priorities, the district is third when we measure percent spent on classified non-management salaries, which is above both the comparative group average as well as the unified school district average statewide. I like this little graphic. This is really just reiterating what we talked about on the previous 3 slides, comparing how much the district is spending for certificated non-management, administrator, and classified non-management salaries, benefits, and then that 5th wedge of the pie, which is everything else. That's all those non-personnel costs. Again, the district is not out of line in any one spot. It is a little bit low on the benefits in comparison, and I'm going to show you some slides later on that are going to really hammer home why the district is a little lower on the benefit side. Okay, just a quick reference here to special education. Again, my partner Brianna is going to go into depth on her analysis of special education. The piece that jumps off the page here at me for Duarte, it does receive the most amount of special education resources per student, whether it be federal or state dollars. but also spends the most per student, which means that the delta between the revenues it receives from the state and federal government and what it spends is made up through a local contribution. And so the district does have the largest contribution per student of the comparative districts. And I'll let Brianna speak to that a little bit more in her report. We talked earlier in this presentation about reserves. I mentioned that the district in the 18-19 year was at 3.37%. The average for the unified districts in 1920 was 18.8. When you look at the comparative list here in the 18-19 year, you can see that, again, just reiterating, district is very, very low in its reserve percentages when compared with those surrounding comparable districts. We look at class size. So when we think about compensation, and I'm going to focus on certificated non-management because this is data that the state does collect. When we think about compensation for employees, it's really a three-legged stool. It's salary, benefits for health and welfare, contributions for health and welfare, and then working conditions or class size. Okay, well, we know as a district, we're not a highly funded district in the state of California, so we can never be the leader in all three. But based on state certified data, the district did have the second lowest average class size in the 18-19 year based on the comparative group average at 23.04, smaller average class size than what you would see at a unified district statewide or in the comparative group. What that's going to tell me is that when you have a smaller class size, there's generally an inverse relationship with compensation. Okay, because again, the smaller class size we have, that means we're going to employ more employees on the natural, which generally means we're not going to be able to compensate those employees as richly as some of the other districts with larger class sizes. Okay. These next three particular data points are looking at compensation for certificated non-management. Good news, this is 1920 data, the most recently available state certified at the time. And based on that 1920 data, we have selected three data points to show for total compensation. And make sure we define total compensation. That is not only salary, but also the average contribution for health and welfare benefits on behalf of the employee that's made by the district. We always want to marry the two for better or for worse. Because we're not a highly funded district, we have some of the smallest class sizes based on the list. It does not come as a surprise to me that we're relatively low on the total compensation rankings when we look at a brand new teacher. And this particular chart is looking at BA30 step 1. So brand new teacher coming out, they have their credential first year coming in. I do think it's worth noting that the low ranking is primarily because of the contribution for health and welfare benefits. When you look at the middle column for salary, the district is actually quite competitive in the salary at $52,871. I think it's third or fourth on the list there when you look at the comparative districts. But again, once you layer on the average contribution for health and welfare, it pulls the district's ranking down relatively low on the list. When you move across the salary schedule, so BA 60 step 10, and this would be a mid-career teacher with 10 years of experience. Again, the salary is not, it's not non-competitive. I'd say it's a rather competitive salary, but when you look at the health and welfare benefits contribution, it brings the ranking down to the bottom of the list. And then when you move to the end of the salary schedule, what is the maximum earning potential of a teacher in Duarte as compared to the comparative group? Again, six-figure salary. The salary is not the piece that brings down the ranking. It's actually the health and welfare benefit component that brings down the ranking for the teachers in Duarte. And then the final data point that I'll share with the board before opening it up for questions is this is just identifying what is the average compensation. So not necessarily where any one employee is, but when you look at the aggregate of all of the teachers in Duarte, what is the average salary? What is the average total compensation? Again, average salary of $81,000, very competitive when you look at the surrounding districts. But again, once you layer on the health and welfare benefits contribution, it does bring the ranking down lower on the list. So that concludes the presentation on the budget as well as the comparative data, and I'm happy to field any questions.
Thank you, Matt. We appreciate the presentation, and I would ask Madam President if you have, or members of the board have any questions.
I have a question.
I'll ask something if that's all right, Madam President. Okay.
Go ahead, Dr.
So Matt, thank you very much for this presentation. Where do we rank, I guess, with our management? Where does our management rank in terms of these breakdowns of salaries and benefits and whatnot?
So that's a
Did
great
you guys
question.
have any? Did I miss that?
No, I might have gone through it too quickly. I apologize for that. I was trying to be mindful of everyone's time this evening. So when we look at the percentage of the general fund that is spent on management salaries, the district is second on the list, which is very similar to the ranking for classified non-management as well.
Okay. And the districts that we were compared to, it was the same districts every time. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, to be consistent in the comparison,
Okay.
the comparative group that I've identified here, which is number of students between 2,000 and 5,000, and then similar demographics. It's the same set of districts throughout each of these tables.
Okay. And then when there was the slide number 18 was showing the unrestricted LCFF revenue per ADA. So why is it that a school like Bassett, for example, would be receiving so much more? Do they just have more students that qualify for that unduplicated money? I don't know what it's called exactly.
That's exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. And I wasn't trying to get away from slide 18, but I wanted to identify, the state provides, we can only normalize this so much. So while we normalized it for unified school districts, the fact that Bassett, 92 out of every 100 students is an unduplicated pupil, meaning they qualify for free reduced price meals, an English language learner, or foster youth. And so the state provides a considerable bump in the LCFF revenues based on the heightened number of students or the higher concentration of students that Bassett has that qualify.
I see. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Board members, any other questions?
I have a question. Is it still open? Yeah, I'm kind of almost from that other, let me see, the slide number, slide number 24, let's say it was slide number 24, whereas Dwardy that's comparative data, and with 3.37, well, I mean, what determines us to be where, that, to be that low? I just don't quite understand it. What determines us to be in that particular comparative data for this particular slide?
So that's a great question. So again, I use the same districts on each of the comparative data slides. The 3.37% is just a mathematical calculation. It's how much money do we have left in our reserves divided by our total general fund expenditures. And it's the same calculation done for all of the districts. So we have an apples and apples comparison here. So, said another way, if we spent $100 during the year, we have $3.37 left in our reserves. Okay, which is a very low percentage. It's just a smidgen. I'll use the technical term. It's a smidgen above the minimum required by the state. And it's certainly, when districts find themselves with low reserves like that, all it takes is a couple increases in expenses or a slight decrease in revenues. And now we're having to make some really difficult decisions, almost knee-jerk reactions. Whereas districts with greater reserves, if they do find themselves in a position with additional expenses or decreases in revenues, they can be a little more thoughtful, if they do need to make reductions in spending.
Okay, and slide number 26, when it comes to the comparative salary data, again, we're very, very low compared to the others. How does that end up being in that particular strata?
Well, this is, salary and health and welfare benefits is the result of years of negotiations, many tentative agreements and signed, ratified agreements that are signed by both parties. I would say that, again, because Duarte is not a highly funded district through the eyes of the state of California, and we talked about that on a previous slide, we can't be the leader in all three things. Collective bargaining agreements have information on class size, as well as information on salary and benefits, and whether intentional or not, the district has smaller class sizes than many of the districts in this comparative group. Because the district is not a highly funded district, the smaller class sizes means that the district is not going to be able to compensate its employees as richly as some of the other districts with larger class sizes.
So it's a decision that we've made at a school district to pay a lesser salary based on the fact that we feel like it's not as important to try to attract the more higher salaried employees.
Yeah, I don't know that I would be as cavalier to make that statement. I would, again, reiterate that it's the result of many years of negotiations where both parties sat down at the table and said, this is what we believe is best. This is what we agree to do. And this is the result of those many years of negotiations.
And Mr. Bell, if I could throw in my 2 cents, Matt's example of you have $100, you can spend $100 on 5 teachers and pay them all $20, or you can spend $100 on 2 teachers and pay each of them $50. So the smaller class sizes means you have more teachers, which means you can pay all of those teachers less.
I got you. Okay.
Okay,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madam President. So I think, Matt, you did a masterful job of kind of dodging that question, which I again appreciate. You said I wouldn't be so cavalier as to make that as an assumption or as a statement. I think Brianna captured it probably better than I could, which is always the statement: we can do anything we want, we just can't do everything that we want. And so when we have a fixed amount of money that's coming in, coupled with some really structural challenges with declining enrollment, structural challenges with continued increases in STRS and PERS costs, continued challenges with rising medical costs that we have ostensibly said, and a part of the collective bargaining and discussion would be, does it make sense to do anything on benefits in these conversations when rates are rising so fast that you can't even necessarily make a tangible benefit to adding things to the benefits? So then money then went on to salaries and so on and so forth. But it really is a mathematical equation, which is we have made the decision, I think collectively over time, to have smaller class sizes because we value choice and we value having the K-8 model. But I'll remind the board that the optimal amount of kids to have on a K-5 campus is probably 500 to 600, and we are operating multiple K-8s south of 500. So if you the math just doesn't make sense. And that's why we have the number of school facilities that we have the number of classrooms that we have, and we have small class sizes because we have chosen to have that as the way that we've laid out the district. We have been engaged in a conversation for several months at this point in time about right-sizing the district, about maximizing school facilities, about consolidation ideas and concepts. So I want to continue to engage the board with your questions, but I would just add to the conversation to say that we are in a position now to look at this report as a validation of a number of the conversations that we have already been engaged in for many months. And so for me, it's keep going in the direction that we've been going, because we know that these concerns and challenges that face us have been now verified and validated by an independent outside third party to the things that we've already been discussing and already been thinking about. So I think that it is all ahead forward with the conversations and the things that we've been already discussing.
And I really appreciate it. I mean, I've been a board member a long time. I've never seen these figures. Never, ever, ever. And we will talk about it more, but I've never seen these figures. So thank you very much.
I don't know if at this point, Mr. Bowler has anything to add.
Mr. Bowler.
Sure. Yes. No, thank you. I unmuted myself. First, I want to thank Matt and Brianna for the work you've done for us. I mean, you make us better, with your analysis, and you validate or bring us around to see school finance in a more global sense, the statewide picture. No, thank you. I think that that your report is something many of the components we've had ongoing conversations about, namely declining enrollment, right, as a number one culprit, and the increased costs of PERS and STIRS, for example. The special education program is, relatively expensive. And so those are the dynamics in the district, and to a large degree, the most significant that we continue to work on. And so thank you for you validated that in this report. And it's very helpful. It's helpful to the administration and to the board, I think, as well.
Thank you, Mr. Bowler. Mrs. Hu or Mrs. Harold, do you have any questions or comments?
I was just going to echo.
Go ahead, Mrs. Hu.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
First,
I was just wondering, I mean, I know that, you kind of stated that, like, overall, the state of California is losing students. And I would agree that there's a lot of families leaving just because of the cost of living is so large. People are able to work from different places now at a lower cost of living. So, I think that, yes, the district is facing declining enrollment, STIRS and PERS, but I think all districts are facing this similar issue. So I'm wondering, so how are other districts able to, I guess, have a higher reserve while, maintaining, because I was looking at Bassett, they had probably the higher number of income per student, but then I noticed that, they had a higher class size, they pay lower salaries on quite a few different levels. I'm just wondering how other districts, maintained a higher reserve balance.
So that's a great question. I think it's worth noting that even before the pandemic, even before the declining enrollment that the district experienced in 1920 and 2021, your reserves were already at 3%. So you started here and you've been kind of treading water to get to where you're at. And I know it's the result of lots of hard decisions and good work by board and members of cabinet. Districts that build up reserves, it's a conscious decision to do it over time. One of the disadvantages that you have at Duarte is that you're not a highly funded district through the eyes of the state of California. Certainly when we showed the data here with the comparative information, but it's a conscious decision. But Board Member Koo, it's a trade-off, right? Because if you're going to make the conscious decision to build reserves, which is not a bad thing, especially when you're at 3%, which is the state minimum, there's a trade-off to that. That means that if you're going to build reserves, that means that you're not doing something else. And so it has to be that conscious decision. That's where this data can be very impactful to say, this is, what is the priority of the board? And that's the beauty of you five as elected officials, is you get to determine those priorities, certainly as a collective 3, hopefully a collective 5. And if you determine that building those reserves is a priority, you have the full authority and vested interest to do so. You'll hear that, well, you're not spending those dollars on today's students, but what you're doing is you're protecting future students from cuts, protecting future students from having a program one year and not having it the next. And it's a balancing act. We get a question a lot at school services. Well, what should we have as a reserve? Well, it's whatever you're comfortable with. I will share my opinion that 3% doesn't make me very comfortable, and using the state certified data, using the comparative list there, I think that's some data to support that 3% probably isn't a real comfortable number.
Before we go with Mrs. Carroll, would you please, Mr. Phillips, elaborate a little bit what are the consequences of going lower than here, 3% for any district? So for public information.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let me back up here. Districts have an opportunity at first interim and second interim to file one of 3 levels of certification: a positive certification, a qualified certification, or a negative certification. And positive means that we're doing well, right? The ship is going along and there's no clouds on the horizon. A qualified certification means that maybe in the current or 2 subsequent years, we may not be able to meet all of our requirements. One of those requirements being a 3% reserve. Negative meaning that in the current or next year, we're going to run out of cash. Okay, so there's a couple levels that occur here. When you get into that qualified territory, which you guys were in, the county office has a number of tools that are available to it. It can assign a fiscal advisor or a fiscal expert, and that person can come in and have a wide range of authority. They can be there as advisory. And if the county office sees the trajectory correcting itself through the hard work of the board, then the fiscal advisor will stay that, just an advisor. If the county office sees that the board is not making the decisions to correct the fiscal trajectory, the county office can actually assign stay and rescind authority to that fiscal advisor, where essentially the board is there just in concept. You're there, you can vote on things, but ultimately if the fiscal advisor does not believe it's for the betterment of the district, they can say, nope, I pull the plug on that. If you find yourself in a position where you get into that negative certification, now we're talking about potentially insolvency. School districts can't go bankrupt, right? We don't close up shop. But what happens is the state of California has a mechanism, and it's only happened to, I believe, 9 school districts in the state of California over almost 30 years now, since 1992, is the state legislature will actually pass a resolution that would provide a loan to the school district. At that point, the school district is basically taken over by the state. The board is there. You don't even get to vote anymore. You're just there. You will have a state trustee assigned to you. Not only do you have to repay the state loan, you repay it with interest. You also pick up the cost of the state trustee as well. And that state trustee's only goal is to get the district solvent again, meaning build up reserves, get the district to a point where expenses do not exceed revenues. That's not a fun place to be. Again, the 9 districts that have had state loans, you think about an Oakland, an Inglewood, West Contra Costa. It's not a fun time because, again, the state trustee they don't live in your community. They don't know your community members. They don't know what's best for the kids in your community. Their only goal is to get the district solvent again so that the state gets its money back. And only then will you resume your power as board members.
Thank you. Mrs. Carroll.
I guess I'm going to add the final thing onto that, saying we don't want to go there. We want to stay away from the negative. I think everyone had questions. I think sort of what I was going to ask, and I just want to say it was a great presentation. Otherwise, like you said, you opened my eyes to pretty much knowing that a lot of this is due to low declining enrollment like we have and low reserves. And throughout the years, how these reserves have been low, like Bassett was maybe theirs was higher, ours has been continually going downward. But otherwise, this is something that I guess as all board members, we have to really think outside the box on this and figure out what we're going to want to do with the district too. And making sure, like you said, we can't have everything. You can't. Some prioritize towards certain things and programs and bigger pay or like I said, the benefit package. So I was happy to see that we, in the sense of pay, we were pretty much in the medium of everything, but when it came to say the contributions and the benefits, we were low on that. So we weren't all too bad. So that made me feel a little better, but I want to thank you for that. So
My pleasure.
And board members or anyone has any comment or question? If you don't, I would like to refer to number 5, slide number 5, which is what is a budget? I would like you to please reflect a little bit more on that because it's the first time that I see it. And I know I hear from Mr. Bowler a lot regarding this. But if you can just, expand a little bit more on this.
Absolutely. I love the enthusiasm about wanting to define a budget. That makes me happy inside. A budget. So what, we say somewhat jokingly about budgets is that by the time we end up closing the year, all of the numbers in the budget are exactly wrong. Okay. But we want them to be approximately right. And the way that we judge whether or not a budget is done well, or the way that I judge whether or not a budget is done well, is really based on the assumptions that are used to build the budget, right? And those assumptions are based on what we know right now. And a lot of those assumptions, we don't determine those assumptions, right? We don't determine how much the state provides in funding. Okay, those numbers are provided to us. We don't determine what the rates are going to be for pension, for CalPERS and CalSTRS. Those rates are given to us, right? We don't determine what the cost increases for health and welfare are going to be. We get those from an outside broker. And so we are heavily reliant on assumptions from third parties. Okay. We can certainly assess the assumptions for reasonableness, but if we can conclude that the information is reasonable, it's coming from a reasonable source, whether it be our outside broker, coming from the state of California, Department of Finance, or what have you, we have to go with that. Okay, because we don't want to get out in front of the state. And I think a perfect example that I'll use from this presentation, when the board approved first interim, the state of California was still in the thick of the pandemic from a financial standpoint. Certainly things were looking better, but we had not yet received an update from the governor or the Department of Finance about what funding for education would look like in the 21-22 year. We had to wait until January to get that information. So in December, when Mr. Bowler presented and the board approved first interim, every CBO, every good qualified CBO, let me say, in the state of California, assumed that there was no new funding coming for schools, meaning that there was a zero cost of living adjustment, not only for the current year, but for the 2 subsequent years. Well, you fast forward to January 10th, which was less than a month, or about a month after the board approved first interim, the governor came out and said, hey, things are looking a lot better. I want to provide an augmented COLA of 3.84% in 21-22. Well, nobody had 3.84% in their first interim, because who's going to get out in front of the governor from that perspective, right? So at first interim, there was an assumption of no funding increase. When Mr. Bowler brought second interim back in March, now all of a sudden there's a 3.84% increase in there. Well, Mr. Bowler didn't make that up, right? The information came from the governor and the Department of Finance. And that number has even changed one more time, or it will change one more time. Hopefully I'm not stealing his thunder for his presentation in a few days. But that number is likely going to go up from 3.84 to 5.07. So it's about the assumptions that are used to build the budget. Trust those final numbers on the multi-year projection are added and subtracted correctly. Okay, but the conversation is around the assumptions used to build those numbers.
Thank you.
Madam President, I just had one other
sir.
quick.
Go ahead.
Matt, could you look at slide number 18? I just want a real quick question, slide 18, the comparative financial data.
Yeah, would you like me to share it?
Oh, yes, yeah. What determined that rating? In other words, I know you were saying how they looked at thwarting. I just want what determines that?
So again, it's a mathematical equation. It's the total LCFF revenues that the district received for the 18-19 year divided by the attendance of the district for that year.
You said the attendance?
The attendance, yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I believe that this presentation, we will need 6 hours just to go over this. It is a lot of information, but it is great to hear for the first time. And I really appreciate Dr. Emerson's efforts to bring school services of California to give us this information. It is excellent and give us an idea of what we need to do. And if it is something that I can take from your presentation and keep it for me, is that assumptions plus today's decisions equal projections. I love that idea. So with that, I think that we will move to Brianna. I think it is, she's gonna go ahead with the presentation.
Good
Only
report,
if you,
Matt.
Mr. Phyllis has anything else to add?
No, I just thank you for the opportunity and the trust in school services to be with you tonight.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Emerson, do you want to add anything?
Yes, thank you, Madam President. So again, I also want to echo the sentiments of the board president, Matt, and thank you for the time and the effort of going through and doing this comprehensive deep dive. Before I bring Brianna on, because I know she's excited to share all things special education, and it was a very, very robust process. I just want to put a couple of fine points on the budget presentation. Again, I want to reiterate that what we learned through the budget report was, again, an affirmation of the conversations that we've been engaged in are exactly the right conversations. There's work for us to do, and we began to lay the foundation for how we can do things like make a decision about increasing the reserves, make decisions about working with our associations to talk about class size or talk about FTE ratios or talk about salaries and benefits. But again, Matt's point around the three-legged stool concept of salaries, benefits, and working conditions, there is conversation that can happen in collective bargaining that can talk about how do you increase and enhance those three components to create workable agreements and solutions about how we move forward. And so I think that there is a lot of different conversations that need to happen and need to move forward. And this again gives us data to then rely on, where we can talk about data-driven decisions. We can use factual information. What I was really excited about is the fact that there were even, because sometimes when you have comparables and you're looking at the entire state, and we want to keep it in a geographic radius, but the reality is that Bassett and Charter Oak are around the corner. So those are two examples that are close and nearby that make it kind of easy to do some looking at and some research and even reaching out and having conversations around how they do things versus how we do. So I think, again, this lays a path for us to move forward. And it is not in isolation. The special education report, members of the board, you will find dovetails quite nicely with the budget report and some of the things that we need to talk about how we move forward. So with that, teeing it up, I might as well play like walkout music for Brianna, for her to come in and start her presentation. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Brianna Garcia to present on special education.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emerson, and thank you this evening, board president and board members and the public that are watching. Matt is always a hard act to follow, so I will do my best. I am going to share my screen so that you can see the special education presentation. All right, can everyone see that? Great. I am doing this presentation on behalf of myself and Charlene Keelau, who was my partner. She wasn't able to join us this evening, but I will take you through this process and just talk with you a little bit about how we put together the presentation, or excuse me, our report, and the findings that we came across. And so really, the district asked us to come in, Dr. Emerson and staff, to look at the district special education programs and try to determine really how and what was the best way to continue to provide cost-effective, high-quality programs for your students. Like other districts across California, the amount of funding that the school district is receiving for special education services, dovetailing with what Matt was talking about, this is money that's coming from outside. So the amount of funding that's being provided to the district for special education doesn't nearly cover the cost of actually educating special education students. And so there's always that gap in between, and working to operate your programs, to provide quality programs to your students and manage those expenditures is something that all school districts are always struggling with. And to use Matt's term, it really is a balancing act in trying to do all of those things. And so the district asked us to come in to look at the programs that you have, and based on our experience with school districts across California, make a recommendation as to where are those areas that the district is doing well, and you should get kudos for those areas, but look at where are those areas where we think we could help you improve the cost effectiveness, of those programs. And so this study really did take a multifaceted approach. We tried to understand what the issues were at the district facing your programs, as well as looking at comparative districts in order to help you provide that comparison so that you could see how it is that you're providing programs compared to other districts within California and within the geographic area. And so we looked at the same. We wanted to make sure that the two studies were consistent and that would help you as you were making your decisions so that you weren't trying to figure out, wait, what's the difference between these two? And so we used the same 11 comparative districts that Matt just talked about in the budget report. You'll note that when we did the comparative data analysis, there were two parts. There was a portion of it that was looking at the expenditure and revenue data based on state certified data. And so we were able to look at all 11 comparative districts. But we also reached out to the districts to see if they would provide us more current data on their staffing. And so of those 11 districts, 4 of them actually provided additional information on staffing information. And so when we talk about the staffing and the programming, it's compared to those 4 districts that provided that data on that piece. Lastly, in addition to all of the data that the district provided to us to review and look at that information, they also were very generous with their time. Your staff, from the paraprofessionals in the classrooms to the teachers to all the program staff and special education to your cabinet, sat down with us over several days and let us ask very nosy questions about the program and how things were working, what things were not working, so that we could put together some recommendations for you based on all of that information in totality. And so we do appreciate all of staff's time for taking the time to talk with us and to gather all the data that we asked for. And so the report was broken up really into 5 broad categories. We looked at the organizational effectiveness because it's important to see how the organization is run, what structures are put in place in order to make sure that the program itself is running effectively. We looked at the program management and staffing, as I was just mentioning, comparing it to other districts in order to determine, based on your general size, do you have comparable number of staff in various positions throughout the special education program? We looked at the revenues and expenditures, so what are the analyses and trends of historical information and moving forward. And then we looked very closely at what drives the cost in special education. That is critical, especially given that gap between revenues and expenditures and the district having to make a contribution to assist in providing that free and appropriate education for your special education students. And so before we talk about, or I go into our findings in particular, I want to take a moment to put the study in a little bit of context. And so this slide, in the handout that you have, you'll note I added a line as I was reviewing the slide to provide notes. I wanted to make that clear. So this is looking at for the student and staff, or the student data, we have data from 1920. And so this is looking at information from 1920 that is state certified, and looking at the districts. At the time that we did this study, the district was at about 3,500 students. And so of those 3,500 students in 1920, 16.4% of those students were identified as students with disabilities. So this represents about a third of the population of students with disabilities in the comparative group. So you can see that they go as high as almost 17% in Mojave and as low as Sierra Sands, which is at 14.7%. The line that I added there in the middle in red, that's the statewide average of students with disabilities, which is about 13.05%. So the district is about 3.4% higher than the statewide average, and also over a percentage higher than the comparative group average for this. And so this is something that's important to consider and look at, because you'll see as we start talking about some of our findings that the identification of students and the referral to students of special education plays into that number and the systems that could be put in place to help look at how those students are identified. So looking big picture, as the district's enrollment decreases, the percentage of students with disabilities has actually increased. Though you did experience a slight drop in 1920. However, that could be due to the pandemic and the fact that you lost students overall. And so that's something to keep in mind. While changes in enrollment have fluctuated over the last 12 years that are shown in this chart, that fluctuation in total enrollment has been within a pretty narrow band. It's declined as little as about 4.5% and increased at about 3.5%. So the increase or decrease in enrollment hasn't been that great over that 12-year period. However, the change in the number of student disabilities has been much more dramatic. It declined as much as 8.31% in a single year. That was the change you can see here between 1819 and 1920. And it increased as much as 16% between the 2012-13 and the 13-14 school year. And because of the numbers that you're looking at, when you're looking at those types of increases from 13.12% in 2012-13 up to, let's say, the 16.4% in 15-16, that's a difference of about 90 students. But because of the size of your district, that percentage really does increase at what seems like a much higher rate. Again, this information is important in the context of how the funding is provided that Matt mentioned. From a fiscal perspective, the more students you have, the larger contribution the district is going to have to provide to special education from the general fund. So first, the funding provided for special education in general is insufficient to cover the cost of providing services to students with disabilities. That's something that is not unique to Duarte. That's something that all districts, I would argue, across the nation are probably facing. Second, because the funding is tied to the total ADA of a special education local plan area, the funding could be going down even though your number of students is going up. So if the total ADA is going down for not only you, but for all of the districts that are within that special education local plan area, then the district is actually receiving less funding for special education students, even if its percentage of students is going up. So the amount that it's receiving per student would be less. And so that's, again, something to keep in mind as we start looking at some of the funding expenditures and the implications of that. And so with that big picture and context in mind, I want to turn to some of our findings and recommendations. And I'm going to do it in those 4 categories that I talked about previously. So the ability of the district to provide effective instructional programs that meet the needs of your students in a cost-effective manner really is dependent on the organization and its culture and its values. When we look to assess organizational effectiveness, we look at the leadership and the overall organizational structure, as well as the efficiency of the organization. And that's the organization, the district as a whole, but also the special education programs. And so these 2 things play a critical role in the district's ability to actually meet the needs of students. The district currently only has 1 administrative position within special education, and that's the director of special education. And I say currently has, meaning you have that position, though right now that position is vacant and something that the staff is working to fill that position. So when we were conducting our interviews with staff and looking at the data, it was very clear from those interviews that that position by itself was not able to really properly support the entire department. While the former director appeared to be very well intentioned and staff talked about how the director was supportive, he really was a one-man show and was spread incredibly thin. And so with trying to manage the department and handle day-to-day tasks and attending IEP meetings, it was really a lot for one person to take on, given the size of the district. We also noticed that there were no clear or consistently implemented district-wide policies and procedures. And where the district does have some discrete policies and procedures, staff isn't necessarily held accountable. And so there seem to be practices in place, but they're not supported by any documents. And so each school site really is doing things a little bit differently and doing things that meet their needs, but it's not being done consistently throughout the district. This was evident when you look at how programs are operated across school sites. Each administrator is taking ownership of their site, which is something that you want an administrator to do. But in the absence of a broader and a cohesive direction from the special education department, that line between what's the responsibility of the school site and what should be happening at a district level starts to get a little bit blurred. And so you see this particularly in how students are placed in programs across school sites, which I'll talk about a little bit more, but really has evolved into a negotiation between school sites instead of something that's being handled on a broader district-wide basis. And lastly, special education specific and intervention focused professional development was identified as an area of need for both special education and general education staff. And I want to be clear that the district is providing professional development opportunities. I don't want anybody to think that's not happening. But it isn't always practical in terms of providing insights for classroom management, nor are those professional development opportunities broad-based and inclusive of all special education staff, so that all of them are able to get together at once or in larger cohorts to have those conversations. And so it appears that there's little special education specific training on strategies and interventions to assist students before they're referred to special education. And again, that looks back at that percentage that I talked about where the district is higher than the statewide and the comparative group average. There are more referrals happening to special education where there's the possibility that if additional training and strategies and interventions were put in place while students are still in general education, that could reduce the need for the students to be referred to special education and provided services under that umbrella. Given the size and scope of the department, we typically see, and so we do recommend that the district consider not only filling the vacant director position, but consider hiring a coordinator or a program specialist type position. And that recommendation we believe would help support the newly hired director so that they can focus on higher level management that is needed to run the department and can do so more effectively and efficiently. And again, you'll see why we really do think that that's something important as we keep going through some of our findings and recommendations. Secondly, clear and consistent district-wide policies and procedures need to be developed and implemented and communicated. And then staff needs to be held accountable to ensure that those policies are being implemented across the district so that you have some consistency and there's not different practices going on school site by school site. And lastly, for organizational effectiveness, we really do believe that increased training on intervention strategies should be provided to both special education and general education staff in order to help provide them with different means and ways in order to help students in the general education environment before being referred to special education. So moving to special education expenditures, I want to start off by noting big picture that special education is not a standalone program. It's meant to supplement the education that's being offered to students in general education and assist those students with disabilities in attaining their educational goals that are noted in their individualized education programs. Students in special education generate those LCFF dollars, those local control funding formula dollars that Matt talked about. They generate those dollars first as general education students, and those dollars should be contributing to their educational attainment. All services that are exclusive of those in their individualized education programs are services that should be provided at a general fund expense. They are not special education expenditures, and those funding sources really should be delineated that way, because students with disabilities are entitled to the same standards of curriculum, technology, and services as all other students at a general fund expense. So taking that and looking at just the special education expenditures, the district is spending a combined percentage of of 91.78% in the categories related to personnel and services. This is in line with what Matt talked about when he was looking at expenditures for staffing across school districts in California, and it is comparable to the average that you're looking at of the comparative average, which is about 92.41%. So based on the data that was provided to us by the district and the state certified data, which was from 2018-19 for revenues and expenditures, the largest share of the costs in this services category that you see here, which is aside from what's being paid directly to personnel, this is the category that you're looking at where you pay for contract services, for some transportation services, those types of things that happen outside of the district. And really the largest share of the expenditures that are being realized in that category are expenditures for transportation and services being provided by non-public schools and non-public agencies. And so of the approximately $2 million spent in 2018-19 for those services, about 80% were attributed to those two categories. And so the district is spending in totality about 20% of its special education expenditures to actually educate students outside of the district. Because partly, and again, we'll be looking at that, the programs that the district is offering within the district itself, and not being able to necessarily meet all of the needs of its students based on the programs that it currently has. I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation that we compared the district to those 11 districts that Matt looked at on the budget side. And they were similarly sized unified school districts, and of this group, the district is spending more on a per average daily attendance basis than any of the comparative group, and it contributes approximately 60.27% of special education expenditures. And so this is saying that of the total costs that the district is spending, so you can see here in this line that for 18-19, for example, the district is spending a little over $10,000, close to $12,000 per student for special education. 60% of that is coming from the general fund from the district, while the remaining 40% or less than 40% is revenues that are actually coming from other outside sources, from the state, federal funding, etc. And so this trend is something that you can see is continuing to increase. It's going up to 62.61% in 1920, and we only had partial data for 2020, 2021 because you're in the middle of that right now. But looking at that, as of January 4th, you were at about 59% contribution. So it looks like that trend is going to continue this year as well. Again, a part of this is due to the fact that funding received by the state for special education services and the districts that the SELPA, the money that the SELPA is receiving is actually a little bit less than what the state target rate is. And so the monies that the district is receiving just isn't sufficient in order to cover all of those costs. That said, there is some additional money that's going to be coming to the districts next year. Part of the budget that is being looked at, or even this year, that funding is increasing, and part of the 21-22 budget is proposing additional increases to special education funding, but that still isn't going to be sufficient to cover that full cost of educating those students. And if you look at the district's total program cost, the district is the second highest in the comparative group in total program cost. It's actually spending more in total program expense than 4 other comparative districts that are larger than the district, and more on a per average daily attendance basis than 5 of the larger districts included within the comparison study. So you're looking at comparing yourselves to districts that are larger than you, and the district is actually still spending more, even though they have more students and more total students in special education than the district has. I just noted that the district contributes 60.27% as a percent of total program expense, which means it contributes over half of the revenue needed for total program expenses from the general fund. And so the comparative group, their average is about 61.4%, so a little bit lower as we saw in the previous slide. And that is a split within the comparative group. Some are actually contributing more than the statewide average of 61%. Some are contributing less than that statewide average, but that's something to keep in mind. The district's transportation expenditures have increased significantly over the last 12-year period. We looked at data going back as far as 2003, 2004. And from that time to about 2012-13, it fluctuated pretty minimally, but in the last 3 years, the costs have increased. So it went from approximately $300,000 3 to 4 years ago, and it's up to almost $800,000 in the last fiscal year, which was 19-20 that we had full data for. A contributing factor to this likely is the distribution of programs within the district and how the students are being placed and how they're being determined, which I'll talk about a little bit more when we look at the cost drivers in the next section. The district is providing transportation to students within the districts for students who are not attending their home school. So a student, for most typical general education students, you have residence areas, enrollment boundaries for each school site, and so districts that are students that are within that boundary go to a specific school. With special education, because of how the programs are distributed, that's not necessarily the case, and so you're having to provide transportation to students who maybe could attend their local school and walk to their local school, or not need transportation because it's nearby, but because you're having to educate them at a different school site, you're having to provide transportation to that additional school. This sometimes is needed. You might not have enough students at a specific school site to provide all special education programs. And so the district really does have to be strategic about where it places those programs in order to maximize and make sure that you have a concentration of students. And so some of those students, even if they were at their home school, might still need transportation. But the fact that you are transporting some students simply because they are not being educated at their home school could help reduce those costs. Based on the data that we analyzed, you had about 175 students in 19-20 that were being provided transportation, and over half of those students are attending a school other than their home school. And so again, while some percentage of these students would still require transportation if assigned to their home school, others would not, and that could realize some cost savings for the district. As it pertains to expenditures, we recommend that staff ensure that any pre-IEP services, again, those expenditures that the student should be receiving outside of their individualized educational program, we need to ensure that those are actually correctly coded to the general fund and not to special education. And some of you and some of the audience might wonder why it matters, given that the district is contributing, 60% or 61% of the cost, or 62% to the general fund, but it has implication for future expenditures, because there is a requirement of the federal government that a district not spend less in 1 year than it did in a prior year. There are some exceptions to allow you to reduce that amount, but those really are exceptions to the rule. And so any expenditures that you have today is going to limit your ability to realize savings in the future. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about how you want to allocate expenditures in any given year, because it's not just an impact for that year, it's an impact that's going into the future. Second, we recommend that the district look at its programs and determine if there are a sufficient concentration of students identified at other school sites to justify adding additional programs to mitigate that need for transportation. This is something that the district will have to do on some established basis. Changing programs from year to year is disruptive for students, and so that's not something that you want to do, but you should develop some cycle where you're looking at that and determining whether you can expand programs. In addition, if the students or if the district were to establish additional programs and more inclusive programs across all school sites, meaning that students with disabilities are educated in the general education classroom with the supports they need, then more students could remain, again, within their home schools, and that could limit transportation costs and also provide a more inclusive environment for those special education students, which is important for their development and for the possibility that they could transition back into general education into the future. So looking at special education cost drivers, ensuring that students are properly identified is important. And as the majority of students that are found eligible for special education remain within special education. Based on the data that was provided, students are not exiting special education at very high rates. Of the 239 students that exited special education over a 3-year period, we looked from 2017-18 through 2019-20, only 39 students, which represented about 16% of your total special education population over 3 years. Those only 39 students exited due to no longer being eligible for special education services. A number of the staff that we interviewed didn't believe that the district really places enough of an emphasis on developing plans for students to exit special education. There's a general sense that once a student is eligible for special education, they stay in special education until they leave the district. As I mentioned before, the district does not have an effective, articulated, standardized district-wide intervention strategy in place, which is likely contributing to the number of students that are being referred to special education. There are also no district-wide strategies that ensure that all schools are implementing district-wide, adopted, and financially supported universal screening, progress monitoring, formative assessments, research-based interventions. Again, site by site is doing what is working for that site and not necessarily a cohesive plan that's consistent across school sites. In addition, while the district is tracking how students are referred to special education, it's not tracking the number of students that are actually found eligible or ineligible for special education, nor the extent to which the students are referred, nor to the extent to which the students that are referred, whether they were provided with those differentiated supports or other interventions and instructions before being referred to special education. And again, this is important in order to determine what pre-referral interventions are effective. You could have, a handful of things that different school sites are trying, but if nobody is tracking to see do they result in a student's being able to remain in general education or being eligible or and actually being placed into special education, you don't know which ones are working, and you don't know which ones then should be spread out and put in place across various school sites. And so the district did initiate the development of a district-wide multi-tiered systems of supports through the state's Scaling Up MTSS statewide initiative in 2018. And it should be commended for undertaking this process. It's a rigorous process and wasn't easy. But these efforts haven't been fully implemented across the district. And so the district is continuing to face those challenges because of that implementation not happening fully. And it looks like that there is a lack of confidence in being able to support the mental and behavioral issues within the general education setting. And so because of that lack of confidence, and even because of academic issues that students might be that are significantly behind in general education, and the lack of those pre-referral supports, that lack of a broader continuum of placement options within the district, a number of staff really do believe that special education is the only way for them to get adequate supports for some of their students, that they're not able to offer those supports in general education. And so the special education really is the one path for these kids. An area of concern was the lack of clarity regarding program definitions, meaning that when a student needs to be placed, the various classes and programs across school sites are not clearly defined, and therefore placement of a student is more about available space, parent preferences, and or a teacher's experience than about what the appropriate placement is for a student or maintaining, or they're being maintained at their home school. This goes back to those negotiations that I mentioned briefly before. Teachers and principals, when they need to place a student or move a student, they start working amongst themselves to figure out, oh, do you have space, or, you know, would it be more appropriate to put a kid in this classroom because that teacher has more experience with those types of students, instead of what the program is designed to provide that student. So because of that, and because of the lack of real established policies and procedures, and the fact that there has been a history of catering to more vocal parents, currently classes really do contain just a range of disabilities and behaviors instead of being designed to meet the needs of students with more similar disabilities or behaviors or academic aptitudes. And because of these less defined parameters, and because of the lack of policies, there really is no stopgap when a parent insists on receiving a specific support or wants their student in a specific class because of something another parent has told them. There's no defensible way for the district to clearly convey, well, no, we're placing the student in this class or this program for these reasons. Here's our offerings. Here's we allow some deviation, and here's the reasons why. It's hard for district staff to do that because those established parameters are not in place. Frustration and uncertainty really are building between school sites because of these negotiations that are happening, and the placement of students. And these really should be a role for the department administration, which again, I tie back to the fact that not only do you need to fill that position for the director, but providing them with the coordinator or program specialist to help support those school sites would allow for them to be more, for the program to be more effective, and to be managed in a way that would be providing more supports to the school sites and to students. So to address these issues, we recommend that the district update and communicate its policies and procedures for general education supports that would be implemented prior to a referral to special education. These supports and interventions need to be tracked to determine which ones are effective and to make sure that they are being implemented with fidelity. And lastly, the district needs to establish clear definitions for classrooms and the programs being offered, as well as beginning the work to develop and offer a broader continuum of program options throughout the district. Overall, in terms of pupil, personnel, and related staff, and these are your psychologists, your speech language pathologists, your health services staff, etc., the district employs fewer full-time equivalents, so fewer staff relative to the number of students with disabilities that you have than the comparative group that we looked at. This is also the case in absolute terms, where the district employs just fewer staff than the majority of the comparative districts. When comparing the department level staff, the district also employs fewer full-time equivalents relative to the number of students with disabilities than that comparative group that we were looking at. It's worth noting that the district does, however, employ significantly more one-to-one paraprofessionals than the comparative group average that we were looking at. As I previously mentioned, while the district intends to hire a director to lead the department, it should also consider hiring a coordinator or program specialist to support that director. And it might want to also consider hiring registered behavior technicians or other mental health professionals that are trained to address drama that really does directly impact student learning. We also think it's important that the district review its existing guidelines as it pertains to school site staff and teachers, their ability to request one-to-one paraprofessionals. We see this across school districts just in general, especially when those policies and procedures aren't clear, when the teacher is struggling with the student in general education or special education, and you don't have those interventions in place, or they don't have the training for that additional management of that classroom. It's so easy, to throw a staff member at it. If I just have another person, that will help me be able to manage that. And that's something that in the long term, you want to put those procedures in place to deal with those things and not keep putting people in place, because that does, it's an additional cost to the district, but that does inhibit a student's ability to be able to start to work and cope on their own, to grow, and again, hopefully be able to, if not completely transition into general education, take part in more general education classes, and be able to fully function more readily and easily once they do leave the school district. So in combination with many of the recommendations that are included in this report, to provide greater training to help general education and special education teachers should also help reduce the number of one-to-one professionals that are needed. And so when you look at the report in totality, there were a lot more recommendations than what I went through and discussed in this presentation. We really wanted to focus on those high level ones, but when you look at the report and look at all of the recommendations, we really do would like you to recognize that there are fiscal implications to all of these recommendations. Some of the items are, just direct money that the district is going to have to pay for staff, etc. But there is also a fiscal cost to just staff's time and resources in order to put some of those resources or some of those recommendations actually into fruition. So we know that the COVID-19 pandemic, declining enrollment, those types of things have been fiscally impacting the district, and it makes some of the expenditure recommendations things that you have to look at over the long term. But as Matt mentioned, you also have some influx of monies right now, one-time dollars. And while you certainly don't want to put those dollars towards salaries or long-term expenditures or things that are ongoing in nature, it does provide you with this small window of a couple of years to use those dollars, to use them as seed money, so to speak, to try to put some of these items in place to get assistance with some of these recommendations now while you have those additional resources, in order to help you and set a basis and a foundation for the long term. And so we recognize that a lot of the implementation of these recommendations are going to be incremental. They can't all happen at one time. And so we do recommend, and we've had conversations with your cabinet about developing a prioritization plan that looks and considers costs, staff resources, feasible timeframes in order to slowly build the program efficiencies and provide those supports that the students need, really both in special education and hopefully more and more in general education with just the additional supports that they need. And so with that, I will open it up to any questions that you might have. But hopefully I did half as well as Matt did.
I have a
I
question.
see Mrs. Carroll's hand first, so
Okay.
Mrs. Carroll.
Yes, this is, Brianna, this is so eye-opening because I think we really needed this one because I'm still really new to the special education. I don't have a child in special education. So a lot of this is, you're learning it right now. But I was going to ask on slide 5, we have 16.40%. You said we're statewide 13.05%. It's the standard, and we really are high for our small district. Is that unusual for a small district like that? I mean, I see we're higher than most. And I guess what I was getting at, since I'm kind of new at this area, is is there a limit or a cap on how many kids we can have in a district? I don't know that answer, and I was just going to ask you on that.
There is not a limit or cap in terms of, there's nothing in state regulations that say you can't go over X percentage in students. However, the district or the state does look at the number of special education students, et cetera, in a district, and there you will reach a tipping point where they're looking at a significant disproportionality, where you're looking at the number of students proportionate to your total enrollment, and where that really does start raising some red flags at the state level. And similar to what Matt was talking about on the budget side, where they'll the county would send in a fiscal advisor, the states would definitely come in and start looking at helping the district develop a plan. And it actually has already done that for significant disproportionality, but based on the number of English learners, et cetera, within the district. And so they will then work with the district to try to ensure that you have the supports, et cetera, in place in order to reduce the referrals to special education. And so that goes back to all of those pre-referral interventions. What are the things that you have in place to help students in general education before they're referred to special education? And that's why it's critical that those supports and that training and those interventions be put in place to try to reduce that number. That really is what will do that work.
Your recommendations were, they made a lot of sense. I was looking at a lot of the things that really need to be done. Another thing is, I always see the acronym for SWD. I mean, it's probably there in front of me. What does that stand for?
Students with disabilities. Sorry.
Okay, just to let people know, because I was sometimes, I don't get all the acronyms to that. And let me see. Slide 15. Help answer. So maybe this is something Dr. Amerson can answer. For slide 15, when it came to mental health counselors and social workers, are a lot of our partnerships that we work with, like in our area? I'm going to talk about DeVille, or does that kind of fall under the guidelines to our partnerships helping out with the students, or is that totally different? Maybe I'm not getting it. So, would you?
No. Thank you, Board Member Carroll. I don't think that question is off base. Yes, we have several partnership opportunities with organizations like DeVille that provide particular services for students. When I look at this particular set of recommendations, I do see it as slightly different because it is specifically targeting specific students who need additional support above and beyond something that may be episodic, like what DeVille may provide supports around. And this gives us an opportunity to look at funding under these one-time dollars that have come in. And again, I'll go back to something that I said in the budget report, which is we can do anything we want. We just can't do everything we want. So this is where Brianna's recommendation around a prioritization of what is first, second, third, fourth, fifth. We're going to have to just get clear on what is the most important things for us to do and in what order. And I will not discount and say that health counselors and social workers to help students who have experienced high levels of trauma, I would say not only related to special education issues, but also just general pandemic related issues, is something that we're going to have to keep as a part of our conversation on an ongoing basis.
And thank you for mentioning that, Dr. Amerson.
Members?
Sorry, I think Brianna, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for mentioning that, because I really do think it's important when you're looking at these types of mental health supports, etc., that you're looking at them at the general education level. So this is something that you're providing to all students, and again, providing to students before it reaches the point where the only option is to provide them with special education services.
Thank you. Okay, James, Dr. Finlay, any comments?
Yes. Thank you very much, Madam President. So, Brianna, thank you very much for this this presentation. This is very, very helpful. I did have a couple of quick questions for you. So, first of all, on slide number 6, that was the slide that showed the ADA for Duarte USD and showed, you know, our declining enrollment, but we don't see a commensurate decline in students with disabilities. So could you comment a little bit on why we didn't see a proportional decline there as the overall student body declined?
I'll note first, big picture, this is again not something that is unique to Duarte. The number of students identified for special education services has been increasing statewide, and I would also argue just nationwide in general. And so that's something to keep in mind. But it really, again, comes down to those interventions and the supports provided to students in in general education before they are placed in special education. And so being able to equip your staff with the training they need, with the supports, etc., that they can put in place so that they can better integrate students within the general education setting and provide them supports before it gets to that point where the only option really is special education, is where it's critical. And so it's different for every school site, for every district. I couldn't say that, it automatically should be going up or down. It really is depending on those policies and procedures, etc., that you have in place in the general education setting before they're referred to special education.
Okay. All right. Great. And then on, on slide number 9, and I think you did mention this in a couple different places under the recommendation sections. It talks about hiring a coordinator or a program specialist to support the director when we do hire one. Given our budget concerns, do you foresee that having this additional FTE will in essence pay for itself along the way to make that recommendation?
I don't know if I'd put it in the term for pay for itself, but there certainly is that ability for, I think you saw in the various recommendations, one of the biggest things that you really do need in place is policies and procedures that are consistent across all school sites. And that one director, it's difficult for that one person to just manage, a department, let alone be able to work through all of those processes. So to have somebody else that can help bear that load, that can start helping putting those things in place, somebody else for the school site administrators to be able to turn to help with those additional supports, I think, yes, in the long term will help the program run more efficiently, and that should help start to bring down costs. Because if you can provide, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, if you can take care of some of those things before students are referred to special education, that's going to reduce that number and reduce those costs in the long term.
Okay, great. And then my last question, and maybe this is not as much of a question, just some clarification or repeating of some information. The slide number 11 that had the pie chart on there, I think you had mentioned that roughly 20% of our budget for special education is going outside of the district. So are you referring to those non-public entities or non-public agencies? Is that what you're referring to?
Correct. That there are services that are being provided to your students. Either the students are actually attending a facility outside your district, or the services that are being provided by outside supports, that and the transportation expenditures. And so those are all costs that aren't going directly to educate the students within Duarte.
Okay. So again, getting back to your point, where if we can prevent some of these issues from cropping up in the first place, or intervene earlier on, we may not have as much of our money sort of leaving the district.
Correct. And I would also add to the other point that I made about a broader continuum of programs and more inclusive programs. If you have more programs and more ways of keeping students in general education with supports, then some of those students that are outside can be brought back into the district, and they can be educated within Duarte. And typically, not always, but typically you can do that more cost effectively than sending them out to some program or service. And so that will help as well.
Okay, great. I appreciate all that information. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Bell or
Yes.
Mrs. Koo?
Well, Jackie, I'm always, if the lady's always first, and I'll follow her.
Mrs. Koo?
Thanks. Hi, Brianna. I guess I was just wondering, because I think going back to Dr. Finley's point about how much money goes outside of our district, is it ever typical for districts to ever, I guess, train within their own staff? I know you noted that we had a high level of paraprofessionals on the one-to-one, but do districts ever, I guess, because I'm just trying to think, you don't want to ever add long-term costs, but, training could be used for like a one-time funding, but then could also keep the services within the district, and then it also builds on the teacher relationships with the students that are already in there.
Yes, so I think that's the general goal of most districts, is to provide as much of the education for their students in-house as they can, and sending them outside to another program is typically the last resort. And so if you have programs within the district that can serve those students, you want to try to do that as much as possible.
So I guess this is a question for Dr. Amerson. Is that feasible? Because I know, special education teachers, not only are they teachers, but they also have caseloads and all of that. So, is that possible to add, hey, we'd love for you to go to these trainings. It specializes you, but, I don't know that threshold of how much they can, I guess, take on.
Board Member Koo, thank you for the question. I think that this is a part of a very large strategic series of conversations that develops the plan for special education moving forward. I think that professional development and training is key to, I think, offsetting and mitigating some of the challenges that we've had with fractured communication, a lack of continuum of services and supports and structures and policies. All those things break down when there isn't the robust training. So I'm going to take a moment just to give Jesus Ruiz some grace, because he worked his tail off, but he didn't have the support undergirding the work he was trying to do. So he was running around doing the day-to-day while trying to also lead, while also trying to connect the dots, while trying to stave off issues. And it was overwhelming and all consuming.
Yeah.
So with that being said, I think that the very first priority before we even talk about professional development is, in fact, to get a new director in place. And I want to move forward with requesting the board's support to advertise and fill a program specialist position, effective immediately. Now, I understand that we have budget constraints and budget challenges, but I think that there was a fair question to say, if we fixed a lot of these things now, would it actually support the district financially in the go forward? I think that the answer to that question is yes, because there are a lot of different things. I could just tick some off the list that I've written down on my notes here. Policy manual development, professional development catalog, position control protocols, program placement protocols, transportation analysis and action plans. All those things are potential opportunities for cost savings to the district, but you have to build the structure in order to get to a place where you can offer robust professional development. The funding for the next several years, I would say the next 2 to 3 years, is there to provide additional compensation, additional opportunities for people to be trained and develop their skills and knowledge to support our students with special needs and our general education students. Because again, if we have a robust Tier 1 and Tier 2 structured system and an overall MTSS framework that supports all students, we can mitigate a lot of the challenges that we've actually faced. So I think this is a very comprehensive approach to looking at it. And one thing I would caution the board to think about with us is that this is a multi-year endeavor that we're taking under, that we're going to be undertaking, meaning it's going to take us multiple years to build up the structures and the systems to adequately address this. I do see Matt's hand, so I wanted to give Matt a chance to weigh in.
Thank you, Dr. Emerson. And one thing when I worked in a district, which I did prior to working at school services, when you have that support and the leadership via director and a program specialist or whatever the title may be, is looking at those students, that 20% where you're sending them to non-public schools and saying, do we have enough students going to non-public schools where we can start our own program, right? Where we can get a teacher and we can staff it. And those costs of non-public schools are through the roof. You only need 3 or 4 kids back in your district to break even. But if there's only one person running around trying to do everything, well, then they're not doing anything. And I'm not trying to undercut what the previous director was doing, but those types of analyses can be huge cost savers, and I would view as kind of low-hanging fruit. And those one-time funds we have now, when we think about seed money, really could pay dividends over the long haul, even though they are one-time funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Madam President, is she?
Thank you.
Raina, I didn't want to break the president's role. Did she? Ken Bell wanted to say something. Raina, is she there?
Okay. Mrs. Stewart, you're done with your questions? Okay. Mr. Bell.
I just want to say, Dr. Emerson, I've been here a few minutes. This is my 30 plus years. This special ed presentation between Matt and Jack, what's the young lady's name?
Brianna.
Brianna. I'm sorry, Brianna. I was mesmerized, so I just forgot. These two presentations in my 30 plus years will probably do more for Duarte Unified School District moving forward. If we can sit down as a board and I know you and your administrative staff, you just got some right-sized things that can happen based just on these two reports that you've given us on special ed. I sat here and thought about so many different things that have gone wrong. Not so much, not trying to blame anybody, but thank you for bringing this and bringing this expertise to us, because this will probably be one of the things that we will remember other than the pandemic that occurred in 2021. And I just want to say thank you very much. I've written many notes, and by the way, I couldn't get the slides that well on my screen. I'd love to be able to get the presentation slide from both these presentations after we leave here, because again, they were excellent and they were right on the money. I mean, right on the money. And again, I believe this, some of the things that you and your staff have done for in this area is also right on time. So again, sir, thank you for bringing all this to us, and I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mr. Bell, and we will have the slide deck for you before you leave this evening.
Thank you.
Okay, board members or anyone have any other comment? One of the best, pleasures to be a president is that you hear all the questions. And I write down a lot of questions, but at the end, the same questions that other board members have is what I have in my notes. And tonight, I just like to add that it is incredible that you serve on the board and you think that we have a lot to read, a lot to prepare for a board meeting. But when you think about all the hours that is put in behind these meetings before we come to the board meeting, is unbelievable. I remember when Dr. Emerson emphasized that he didn't want just to have a budget review. And I remember we talk a lot. I want to have a special ed study too. I want to have budget review, but also a special ed review. And now I understand why. And I can see that is amazing to have this information and for us to understand better how the budget works with this much explanation and information that we have, and how the special ed works too. And the responsibility that everyone who is part of special ed have, and that includes us, because we are part of that group. And so I believe that this presentation will put Dr. Emerson into work extra hours with us, just related this presentation. And that goes for Mercedes too, because Mercedes have to work a lot with him and all the cabinet. I appreciate all the efforts of Dr. Hillman, Mr. Crosby, Mr. Bowler, everyone who participated to prepare this meeting. And I cannot imagine the many hours that the school services of California came and grabbed so much information, but the times that everyone from our district also provide that information to them. The only question that I will have is, and forgive my ignorance, but this is something that I want to know. Why that we did have, I will tell, fundings, and give me a second. I did write it down, so I didn't want to forget about to ask. Why do we have a budget review fundings, but we did have funding? Why do we have fundings and recommendations in a special ed study, but not recommendations on the budget? Anyone?
Matt, you want to take that one, or I could take a stab at it?
Yeah, maybe I'll set them up and you knock them down, Dr. Emerson. So in the great question, Madam President, recall that the budget review, it was two components. There was the budget review component and then the comparative information. The comparative information was really intended to be just that, informational. So there's no recommendations necessarily that would come from the comparative information aspect of the budget review. The budget review itself, there was, I concluded that section by saying that there was no assumptions that the district used at the time that really warranted a recommendation to change, because it was anchored in current information. It was anchored in the best information that was available at the time. And with the recognition that the assumptions will change, and we talked about some of those assumptions that have already changed a couple times since December. But again, at the time, Mr. Bowler and team were using the latest and greatest information, what any CBO would be using across the state of California. So the budget review did not warrant any recommendations.
Thank you.
And I would only add, Madam President, that the budget is kind of at the end of the day a series of calculations. It's a mathematical equation. They're numbers. There are only so many different ways you can chop up a dollar, but our special education program had a lot of nuances and a lot of key learnings that we had because of really, really important conversations that were had with staff. And they really, really informed like what we need to do, where we need to head next. Their feedback was critical. And I think that one of the other major components to how we move forward is to take the budget review, understand that we're operating from a good foundation of assumptions, a good analysis of our numbers. We're following the appropriate protocols and procedures to have sound budgeting and fiscal practices. Recognize that there are things in the comparisons that we can have conversations around long-term decision making that we've had as a district, and then couple that with a complete redesign and rethink around the special education program, to almost engage in first principles thinking of just get rid of all of the preconceived notions and assumptions that we had about how special education should run. Let's take the School Services of California findings and recommendations, and let's rebuild special education brick by brick, person by person, student by student. That's really what we have the opportunity to do, because not only do we have a roadmap, we have a brand new leader who we're going to introduce, hopefully with the board's approval, on Thursday evening. I saw head nods, so you all nodded about the program specialist. So I'm going to take that as license to move forward. So we can put the program specialist in place, and then we can start to build brick by brick. So I think that's why I made the statement at the beginning that these two presentations really, really dovetail together, because it gives us a strategic series of conversations that we as leaders will be able to use as a backdrop for many, many years moving forward, to your point and to Mr. Bell's point.
And I appreciate your comments, Phillips and Dr. Emerson, because I did ask at the end of the budget report the assumptions plus today decisions equals project. So I knew it, but I know that in reality, we need to inform ourselves and the public because it takes time from our lives to learn, but also to make sure that we implement what we learn. So with that, if any other board members or anyone has any other comments, otherwise, I just will remind everyone that this is Receipt for Information, February 2021, School Services of California Budget Review for the Duarte Unified School District is done, and also Receipt for Information, the February 2021 School Services of California Special Education Program Study for the Duarte Unified School District is done. And so I just gonna move to adjourn the meeting.
So
And
move.
once again, if anyone has any comment, otherwise I will need a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I did hear Mr. Bell already.
Mr. Bell, move.
Second?
Yes, ma'am.
Second, Mrs. Carroll. Any discussion? Enjoy your time up there, James. I will call. Mr. Bell, are you ready to adjourn?
I'm ready to adjourn.
Mrs. Carroll
Yes.
and Dr. Finley.
He's gone.
Yes.
No, I'm just-
Mrs. Fu
Yes.
and Reina Diaz. Thank you for a great presentation. Good night, everyone.
Good job, man.
Brianna, thank you guys very
Good job.
much.
Good
Good
job.
Thank you guys so
night.
much.
Thank
Good job.
Good night, everyone.
you.
That was great.
That was an excellent meeting. Thank you,
Yes,
Mercedes.
it was. Yes, it was.
It was a moment